Hello, my name is Christine Gelley, and I am going to be speaking with you all today about strategies for multi-species grazing. I apologize that I can't join you in person. Unfortunately, one of my children wound up sick with what seems to be the flu today, so it seemed best to stay home and convey this information to you in a different format. So I hope that you will find this recording a good substitution for my presence in person. And I also hope that perhaps as a result, you'll be able to consult some additional references from The Ohio State University that could be accessed as video or articles as well on some of our websites. So let's dive into this topic, and I will share some of both my experience in university research on how it pertains to grazing multiple species in the same pasture, whether at the same time or just on the same space. And we'll talk about how to do that to the best of our ability. I am the educator in Noble County, which is in Southeast Ohio, a bit further south than Millersburg, but we do have a lot of experience with grazing because it's what our topography is best suited for, either forestry or pasture. And so when we think about this concept of managing pasture, a lot of people would describe themselves as cattlemen, for example, or shepherds when somebody asks, "What is it you do for a living?" You might say, "I'm a farmer." Maybe you're a hobby farmer. Maybe you work somewhere else, but your hobby on the side or evening job is to take care of livestock. Usually, in those types of conversations, we turn the conversation towards the animal that we're managing. But I think we should also pay due credit to the fact that we should also be grass farmers. Because the thing that we're really growing to initially feed those livestock is pasture. And while that may not be just grass, hopefully there's an incorporation of other legumes and forbs as well. That is the thing that we need to manage first and able to fully manage our livestock to the best of our ability. So a good manager should be both a livestock manager and a grass farmer. In order to fully know the animal, know how it will perform, what it needs, we also need to understand its food source. So whether you're feeding hay or you're grazing pasture, forage quality should be one of your top priorities. On this slide, I say get to know your goat. It may be your goat, it may be your sheep, your chicken, your hog, your horse, whatever it is that you're out there grazing. It's important that we understand their anatomy and how it works to power their bodies so that we understand how to fuel it with forage. So, knowing the basic anatomy of our animals is one of the most important jobs that we have. We need to understand the bodily systems and how they work together for the animal's health, including both the digestive and reproductive systems, as those drive most of what's happening for production purposes. It is important to know both the parts inside and outside of the animal and how those may be impacted in the pasture. Especially when we're thinking about multi-species grazing, we can sometimes have situations where animals may or may not get along, and we will want to be examining the outside of the animal regularly to make sure everyone is cooperative and there's no bullying going on in the group, but also understanding that looking at the outside of the animal can tell us quite a bit about what's going on the inside. And so being able to know what's normal appearance for an animal and what's not is also important. For example here, these are diagrams that show the digestive and reproductive tracts of a goat. It is important that all of us, regardless of what kind of animal we are managing, we understand these systems. Because if we don't understand how the digestive tract works, we may not feed it correctly, and it could lead to abnormal uh, performance or even illness. Same thing goes for the reproductive system, but it's important to know that all of these parts of the reproductive system are dependent on what happens in the digestive tract. And so, if we're not feeding the animal appropriately, it's not going to reproduce successfully either, whether it's a goat, a cow, or a chicken. So, how can we troubleshoot things to know if we're doing things well? Body condition scoring is an excellent way to do that. And I won't elaborate too much because I'm sure that the speaker who follows me today will elaborate some more on body condition scoring for small ruminants. But you can body condition score essentially any type of livestock. Now, each species can have different scores to look at and decide if an animal is performing well or not. I don't have body condition score here listed for hogs or for poultry. I don't encounter grazing systems with those two species very often, but they could also be incorporated. So familiarizing yourself with poultry or hogs as well could be beneficial if you're looking into those systems. But checking condition is easier and quicker for many operations than actually running animals through a chute and weighing them. And also, when we have mixed groups of animals, we may not get an accurate picture if we're just looking at weight alone. We want to look at the whole body of that animal, look at things like fat cover, and also joint movement and foot health, things like that. The condition of the animal may change based on what nutrition we provide, but also may change based on things that we can't control, such as the environment, including things like temperature or humidity. So we want to use these guides to help gauge if our animals are performing well or if they are struggling. And so in all of these cases, beef cows, horses, dairy cows, sheep, and goats, 1 is the lowest number on the score sheet, and 5 is the highest, or 9 in the case of beef cattle and horses. So 1 being extremely thin and 9 or 5 being extremely fat. We want to be somewhere in between for ideal body condition score. This is an example of how body condition score would look for cattle. In this case, we can make quick observations when we compare a body condition score of 1 to a body condition score of 9. Extreme differences between those two animals, and I hope that you never see either of those extremes on your farm. We want to try to stay somewhere in the middle here, the center column between 4 and 6, maybe even into 7 in some cases. And occasionally we'll have animals that are 3s. But hopefully, by performing body condition scoring, we can prevent getting into that very thin, emaciated, or obese and very obese categories. It doesn't take a lot of effort to make observations like this. We just have to do it and be familiar with what it looks like on our animals. In this case, I chose this example with illustrations because it can be difficult to compare charts for different livestock dependent on things like hide color. So if you're looking at a picture of a Hereford cow, but you're trying to body condition score an Angus, it could look very different from the picture you're looking at. But in an illustration like this, I think the shadowing does a very good job of showing us things like, can we see or feel the ribs or the hip bone? Do we see or feel fat deposition that's abnormal? But these charts exist for all species, so if you need help locating those, just reach out. We'd be happy to connect you. Other ways that we can troubleshoot issues, one of those is just to monitor overall animal health and welfare. We want to know what normal body temperature would be. Again, I don't have hogs and chickens on here. I personally have never taken the temperature of a chicken, although I raise chickens. So I'm not sure what normal body temperature is for poultry, but we could look that up for you as well. But we want to make sure that our animals are within this normal range. If they seem to be acting funny, one of the first things and easiest things we can do is take their temperature and see if it's in a normal range. If they're too cold or too hot, then we can begin to take action from there. We also want to take care to monitor mucous membranes, say the areas around the eyes, the mouth, the nose, and also on the other end, to see if we have any abnormal discharge from any of those openings of the body. That can be a clue. Paying attention to tissue color in the incident that we may have parasite issues. We can look for signs of anemia. We could also potentially see signs of vascular constriction if we have some blockage within the body that's preventing good blood flow. We could also see symptoms of bruising in the incident that we may have some animals not getting along in the pasture. We want to be paying attention to tissue color when we take a look at those animals, as well as mobility, vigor, and body structure in general. If somebody's not moving well or moving abnormally, that's a sign that they may be in pain. We may need to explore further. Vigor, just overall get up and go. wants to be alive, right? That's what we're looking for in these animals. If any of those things seem amiss, we want to address that right away. It may be something that is due to the condition of our pasture. It may be something else. But identifying those animals is our first step, and then seeing how many animals could this be affecting? What might be the potential source? Understanding how all of this plays together and affects energy demand in the animal is important because that comes together to tell us how we're going to set up our pastures, how we're going to move animals through. At what point do we pull animals off of the pasture? Do we leave them on all year? Do we supplemental feed? Understanding how energy demands change based on what's happening in the body can help us prepare ahead of time. It helps us anticipate those changes before they happen so it's not a surprise. So in this chart, what we're showing is weight gain and weight loss based on different things that happen with this example of a breeding doe. So this example is a 12-month calendar. Let's say it starts in January, ends in December. And in this case, the doe would be giving birth to a full-term kid in December. So what's happening? At the beginning of this cycle, this is right after birth has begun, that birth has occurred. And so lactation begins at this point. So energy demands on the body are extremely high. So what we see happen here is typically the animal does not gain weight. It in fact loses weight because it is consuming more energy than it's actually able to get from its feed. You know, it's feeding another animal from its body. So we're deficient in energy. We want to make up for that with high quality feed. At the point that the offspring is weaned, the animal has a chance to gain weight back. The energy demand has now been reduced, and so they can gain that energy back for their own bodies, get back in shape for breeding, and be ready to go. And then after breeding, hopefully we have gestation and we have a fetus growing, and that's going to contribute to weight gain, not necessarily because the animal's eating too much, but because it is growing a fetus or two or three potentially, or maybe it's laying an egg. But this time frame that occurs after breeding, we see also an increase in energy, but it may not necessarily be an increase in intake until we get later into gestation. And then we'll also might see that plateau once the belly is so full of food that there's no more space when it's competing with the fetus. But what we're seeing here again, change in weight gain throughout a calendar year. And this shows us how energy demands are changing over the same time frame. So whenever the animal is losing weight, that's a signal that we need to provide more energy. And when weight is increasing, we may not need as much energy. We may need other nutrients to sustain that growth. And in the case of this was a market animal, we would want to be seeing that increased weight gain um, that's leading us to a market weight. This is a similar example, but using a beef cow as an example, showing 4 stages of the life cycle. And what we basically see here is the division of energy requirements and what they go to. So this tan bar on the bottom showing the animal needs this much energy to maintain normal bodily function. The blue is showing you how much it needs for activity, getting around, moving. And then the red portion is showing us what is needed for reproduction and feeding that offspring once it is born. So again, we see these changes in energy requirements based on the life cycle. We've got to be in tune to these life cycles to be good pasture managers, knowing how much they're going to eat when and trying to synchronize that with forage growth. As much as it's important to understand our animals, it's equally important to understand our grass, or legumes in this case. And so what I have on this slide is a brief introduction to anatomy of grasses and legumes. These are completely different plants. There are many species in both categories, grasses versus legumes. They are not created equal. But when we look at the differences between grasses and legumes, we see differences in the way that they grow. Our grasses are monocots, which means one seed leaf. So when the seed sprouts, a single leaf comes out of there, and that begins the growing point. The apical meristem is pretty close to the ground, and all growth is going to initiate from that point. Grasses will also tiller, so they'll create new stems and shoots um, from additional sections of grass, but they won't sprout from the top to make additional um, inflorescence stands. So as you see in this picture, there's one flowering stalk on this grass plant. Whereas in legumes, that's not the case. We have many growing points on this white clover example. And so these plants are going to have more branching. They are dicots, so when they come out of the seed, they have two seed leaves, and that's one way you can tell them apart very early on. The way that they spread can be different as well, but both grasses and legumes can have rhizomes, they can have stolons, and these are ways to reproduce without sexual propagation. So this can make a difference as we're seeing what's spreading throughout our pasture and why. We may see populations of our plants change over time that we didn't induce from seeding. It may be the plant's choice of method to reproduce. So we'll see some preferences between grasses and legumes. Some grasses will prefer to reproduce by seed, where others may prefer to reproduce by spreading. And that habit can also be changed by the way that we manage. When we manage to reduce seed head production, we'll often see more reproduction from tillering, rhizomes, and stolons. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about plant physiology, but we are focusing on the grazing management aspects today, but it all ties together. So in the chart that we see on the bottom here, this is showing us typical growth patterns of cool season and warm season grasses. This chart is taken from the University of Tennessee, so our growing season is close but not identical to this. We could probably just shift the chart a little bit over this way, more into the March start, and it would be a little bit more accurate. But what's important here is looking at those humps in the chart. What we see with cool season grasses is they put on a lot of growth really fast in the spring, which then tapers off as we get into summertime. But warm season grasses, as the name implies, will put on most of their growth midsummer. And so, depending on what plants we have available to use, we can capitalize on both of those growing seasons in our grazing systems. But let's talk about what actually makes those two plants different. Well, the differences come in the way that they actually photosynthesize. And photosynthesis is, of course, the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy. So this is taking in carbon dioxide and water, expelling oxygen and sugars into the plant. And the photosynthesis process occurs in the chloroplasts of the plant. There are multiple pathways for photosynthesis. There is C3, C4, and CAM, which occurs in cacti. I assume nobody in the audience is going to be growing cacti as forage, although it is possible. But we're going to focus on C3 and C4. So C3, those are the plants that have a cool season growth habit. They produce 3 carbon sugars. C4 plants, those are our warm season plants, and they produce carbon chains with 4 carbons. So they have 4 carbon sugars. And what we see is that those cool season plants have optimum growth temperatures between 65 and 75 degrees. So that's why we see that flux of growth in early spring, and then again we see a boost in growth in the fall before winter occurs. Our warm season plants, they prefer to grow at 85 to 95. So you can pretty well pinpoint most of their growth will occur between June and August in Ohio, with the acceleration of growth beginning in May and declining as we get into fall. The benefits of these warm season forages compared to cool seasons are that they have greater water use efficiency, so they can actually put on more mass with less water. Because they can survive with less water and continue growing, they are more drought tolerant. And because of that accelerated growth rate, we can put on a lot of growth very quickly to help compensate for that loss of forage mass in the summer from cool season grasses. Elaborating a little bit more, when we look at a plant and then when we talk about how to manage them in the pasture, we're going to talk about vegetative growth versus reproductive growth. In a plant, our vegetative growth structures are going to be the roots, the leaves, and the stems. This is growth that either aids for the capture of energy or the storage of energy. The leaves of the plant have the greatest nutritional value to livestock. So we want to be managing our pasture system so that we have as many leaves as possible for them to eat. They clearly aren't going to go for the roots without exerting a lot of effort. And stems can contain more fiber than we actually want um, to provide in that full healthy diet. We could have a little bit of backup in the system. We could have a lack of essential nutrients if our forages are too stemmy. The leaves are the target here. We want to manage our plants for healthy leaf tissue and healthy root tissue so that we continue to get good growth. If we overgraze our systems, we will stress the root system, and that will stress the regrowth. In turn, though, if we undergraze, what we'll do is accelerate the entrance into the reproductive phase. And once a plant goes into the reproductive phase, it's ending its cycle for the year. It's already reproduced. It can go on rest time now. And what we don't want is for it to go on rest because then our animals don't have as much to eat. So we're hopefully going to employ some management intensive grazing strategies that allow for adequate rest of both the root system, time for the meristem to activate new growth, and time for those leaves to expand fully and have a good food source for our livestock. As we move forward into the reproductive portion of the plant, the structures that we see there are going to be the seed or the vegetative structures that can spread the rhizomes and stolons that I mentioned previously. The rate at which plants mature is going to depend on the plant type as well as the environment, and but consistently across the board, the best forage quality for livestock of that plant is right before they enter the reproductive phase. In grasses, this occurs just prior to the boot stage, which is when the seed head is emerging out of the grass blade. And for legumes, this is in bud to early bloom. The legumes will put on a traditional flower as their reproductive structure. So when we see those buds begin to come on, we know that is the signal that this is the best time to consume this forage. As it begins to bloom, we start to see that shift in quality occur because energy is being allocated to that flower instead of the rest of the plant. So if we can still catch the plant in early bloom, we are capturing the best quality at that time. Once the reproductive phase is reached, we know that that shift in energy goes away from the leaves and away from the stems and into that flower. And that's not the ideal thing for our animals to graze, so they will miss out on the energy that was in the leaf and stem tissue. How quickly this happens is dependent quite a bit on the life cycle that the plant has. So let's look at the different life cycle classifications. This is very helpful for knowing what to plant or what you're dealing with in your pasture. We can divide these into annuals, biennials, and perennials. In almost all cases, we manage biennials as annuals in pasture systems. So we'll talk about those kind of together. Annuals are those that require reseeding to come in the following year. Biennials actually have a 2-year life cycle to get to reproductive phase. And perennials are those that return from the root system year after year as long as they are healthy and continuing to grow. Now, I mentioned those biennials, typically grown as annuals, because we're not going for the seed. We're not going for the reproductive phase. All we really want is year one. So we'll continue to plant those year after year to get the vegetative growth that we're looking for and avoid the production of seed. Although botanically speaking, they are biennials. Incorporating different life cycles gives us way more flexibility in our pasture systems. We can use these to our advantage to either rejuvenate areas that we want to enhance or as a method of preparing an area for reseeding, or even just providing a boost of extra energy or extra dry matter to those animals if what we currently have growing isn't quite enough. So we can strategically look at ways to work those into our system. We can additionally classify these into summer annuals and winter annuals. Summer annuals are those that grow in the warm season. Winter are those that grow typically from the beginning of fall through the winter. They may grow, they may rest, and then they'll actually flower in the springtime. So we can again use these options to offset that time when the plants that we're most familiar with in Ohio aren't actively growing and providing the needs for our livestock. And then we can classify our perennials into warm season and cool season, as I previously had mentioned. So our warm season perennials are certainly an option for grazing systems in Ohio, although they may be less familiar and they do take quite a bit of time and investment to get started. But they can be helpful, useful, and they can thrive for decades once we do get them to that established phase. But most likely what you're familiar with is our cool season perennials. These will typically grow well from March to June, September to November. They include our red and white clovers. Alfalfa is also included, orchard grass, the different types of fescues, timothy, bluegrass, and the list goes on. In all situations here, we want to manage these plants for best quality, not necessarily best yield, because highest yield does not equal highest quality. So what should be more important to us, quality or yield? I hope that you answer quality, especially in a mixed species grazing situation, because everyone's going to eat different quantities of feed. We want to make sure that whatever it is that they're eating, it's worth eating, and that by doing so, we can reduce our need for supplemental feed in the process. So we want to make sure we're finding balance in managing for both quality and quantity, with quality being our top priority. We know that as plants mature, quality declines, as we mentioned previously, because of that allocation of energy changing from from vegetative structures to reproductive structures. So this is just a chart that shows you how that occurs with the example of orchard grass. Across the board, we see our nutritional value decline as the plants age. That occurs across the board, but at varying rates with different plants. Some tips specifically for grazing after we understand more about how these plants function and how we can use them to our advantage. Everything comes down to being a good pasture manager. And what that means is we are allowing adequate space for the number of animals that we have. We're providing rest for the forage so that it can continue to be healthy and regrow when we need it. It means that we're avoiding exposure of our animals to lots of manure, especially manure of their own species, because that's where we're going to have the most issue with health concerns. So we want to avoid feeding in the same area that we have manure accumulation. We want to make sure that we're grazing our forages to the appropriate height, because that height is a symbol of where the active growing point is. When we damage the active growing point, it triggers the plant to have to grow from the root system instead of from the stem tissue. That takes time, it takes energy, and it will stress our plants over time. So keeping an eye on the height of our plant can be just as effective as many of the other ways we may survey pasture health. And we always want to provide clean water and access to free choice mineral. And you will want to be careful about how you supply mineral if you're using a mixed species grazing system, because different animals have different mineral requirements. And many of you will know, if you are a shepherd, you're managing sheep, that sheep have some sensitivity to copper at levels that are actually desired for other species. So if you are managing sheep in a multi-species grazing system, you will want to be careful with how you're providing access to minerals and making sure that they are appropriate for each species. The amount of space that each animal needs is highly dependent on its own size and also the condition of the site and the weather. But the best way to make sure that that works to everyone's benefit is to implement rotational grazing. So we're constantly keeping the animals moving, we're constantly exposing them to new pasture to graze, and when we do that, we allow the pasture they've already been on to rest. This is going to allow for best forage utilization. They're going to eat more of what's available because they know they have limited time to access it. It's also going to contribute to better parasite management than continuous grazing would be. So continuous grazing, we're going to see animals have a preference for specific plants and keep going back to those plants over and over. They'll develop habits to hang out in the same places of the pasture. And when they hang out in the same place, what else hangs out? Manure. What hangs out in manure? Parasites, How do parasites get into other animals? From the poop. So we want to make sure that we are doing our best to spread that manure out evenly across the pasture and allowing enough time that we reduce exposure to sensitive species. So when you're thinking about how you're going to rotate the species through your pasture, there's lots of different methods that you can go with depending on what you're working with. And since I can't be there to talk with you specifically about your situation, let me just throw some examples out there. I'm going to move ahead to the next slide, but continue to talk about how to move these different animals about. So let's say that you were doing cattle, sheep, goats, horses, chickens. Ooh, a lot going on there. So one method that you might do is to keep the sheep and goats together. For example, let them move through first, graze as much as they want, move them on, and then bring in cattle and horses. Why not? Bring them in together. Similar body size, different grazing habits, similar food preferences. Let them come in next. Cattle and horses are not going to be susceptible to the most concerning parasites that we have in sheep and goats. So we can use them as a bit of a vacuum for those parasites and prevent exposure. Say if we were doing sheep followed by goats, those goats would have the potential to pick up parasites that are shared with sheep, and then we make the problem bigger rather than smaller. So if we keep those animals together that have similar parasite concerns, we can move them along, giving them fresh access to pasture each time that they're moved, followed by cattle and horses, followed by chickens. I will always suggest putting chickens last in the rotation because they are like little compost bins. They go through everything and they find the little bit of nutrition in it. They're after bugs, they're after seeds. They will pick through poop and they will find that one bit of corn that didn't get fully digested and they will eat it. And you know what? They will turn it into meat and eggs, and I will eat it and I will enjoy it myself. So those little recycle bins, little compost bins that are moving, foraging, I will always suggest they go through last. And we can edit that system depending on what you have available and how much space you have. If you're incorporating different animals, you have different animals at different times of year. I'd be happy to talk more with you. If you'd like to contact me by email, my information is going to be at the end of this presentation. But those different animals are going to require different amounts of feed at different times. And that's one of the reasons why we don't want to continuously graze. I think the worst situation we could do is we take all of our animals all at the same time, we stick them out on the same pasture, and they just stay there together. That's not really grazing. That is a holding pen. And what we're going to see is that the forage quality is going to rapidly decline. We're going to see selective grazing pressure actually make the situation worse for the plants that we want to grow and better for things like weeds. And then we're going to wind up in the situation where we go, where did all my grass go? All I have is weeds. Where did these weeds come from? Well, the weeds moved in because the plants that were desirable weren't able to stay competitive in the system. They were being abused. So what we want to see is we want to see rotation implemented. That's going to promote forage health, which is in turn going to promote animal health. And then the more frequently we can move our animals around, the better. Whether they are moved all in one group all together at the same time, or if they're moved in cycles, with one species moving followed by another, followed by another. We want to make sure that the way we design that system, we're allowing adequate rest before they come around to the beginning point again. And that's going to change depending on the weather and the season. We can move our rotations faster in early spring. We typically slow down quite a bit in the summer when growth is slow, and again slow down in winter when growth is slow if you're doing things like stockpiling. So paying attention to stocking density is huge here. We want to make sure that we are allowing the animals access to a pasture at a ratio that makes sense. So we're saying per, acre per animal. How do we know what the right acreage is per animal? Well, in order to do that, we actually have to measure how much forage we have, and we also need to know how big our animals are and anticipate how much they're going to eat. And then we need to rotate them accordingly. Some tools we can use to make this work to our advantage are a forage guide, a book of some type. I love this pocket guide. I keep it in my car. I keep it in my backpack. I take it with me everywhere. It has conversion guides in it. It has how to calculate the area of a circle, how to calculate the area of a rhombus, so that you can go wherever, whenever, and figure out how many acres do we have to work with here. And then you could take a forage sample and you could see how much it weighs. And you could say, we have 3 tons of forage available here. How many animals do we have? Oh, well, that could feed them for so many days and move on from there. Also, having a pasture guide that shows you information about different species can be very helpful. If you see a plant that you've never seen before, you can quickly identify, is this a friend? Is it a foe? Do we need a herbicide? Do we need to graze it? What's our plan of action? Um, a pasture stick is a very simple tool that is very easy to use. We actually have a video available from OSU. This link down here, go.osu.edu, grazing stick how to, that can show you how to use that tool. If you don't have a grazing stick yet and you are getting into the grazing game, you need one. Connect with your local extension educator to get one in your hands. It is a fabulous tool. You can scan this QR code right here and it will take you to that video. I'll give you just a second to do that if you'd like. And then movable fence is something that can be super helpful and cost efficient. Not everybody has the dollars or the time to get perimeter fence laid everywhere or a permanent fence. And you know what? In many cases, you might not want that. Who wants to be tied to long-term decision on how big your pastures are going to be? You might change species. You might move, and then you lose your investment. But a movable fence can give you so much flexibility. It can help you shorten or lengthen grazing rotations depending on the day. It can help you with that seasonality between, say, breeding time and time that you take animals to auction. You're going to have fluctuations in how many animals you have throughout the year. So using that movable fence is very helpful. And then also a tip with the movable fence, in the picture that we see here, there's strands of electric wire. But there's also in the back electronet. So you can see that that electronet is in place to help hold those goats in. A lot of information, not a lot of the information for the animal about electric fences, I want to avoid that. Not actually, is it strong enough to keep me in, but ouch, it hurts if I touch it, right? But some animals can be smart enough to wiggle their way in between those strands of wire, so we may want to incorporate netting. Netting is common for goats as well as poultry. Other animals, especially larger animals, will be more respectful of less fencing, amazingly enough. So take the time to pick out good fencing materials that are flexible enough for you to purpose in all the areas on your farm, give you that most flexibility to make changes as the seasons go. And then you can also use a paper bag and some clippers, and you can go out, you can cut some forage like I was talking about, and you can figure out exactly how much you have here. I mean, in the square, exactly. And then you can use that information to make assumptions about the rest of your pasture. Therefore, every time you do a movement from one section to the other, you can get an idea of about how many days will these animals last here. How soon do I need to move them again? These tools are simple. They just take your time to implement. And I definitely think they are worth it. In these charts here, what we see are some guidelines for at what point should we stop grazing and how long should we let this forage rest before we come back to it. As I was talking about those stocking densities, you'll often see in publications the reference back to animal unit equivalent. What does that mean? It means when you're doing forage math, the number one means a 1,000 pound cow, not pregnant, not lactating. So you can use that frame of reference to change based on the different animals you have in your system. So let's say you don't have one 1,000 pound cow, you actually have 5 sheep. Okay, you can use this animal unit equivalent to go down and see a U, that is dry, is worth 0.2 animal units. So that would mean that 5 sheep in this math would be equivalent to 1 cow. It is not exact. It is an estimate. We have lots of variations between species that can change this, but this is to give you a general estimate of what you're working with. And it can be very helpful, especially in the off season when you're trying to plan ahead. There's lots of grazing math here that we're going to skip through quickly, but this is an example of how you can use that information you gather with your forage tools and with those stocking density equations to get to an endpoint. We're not going to elaborate on this, but these are the equations that you may use. You're going to need to figure out how much your animals weigh, how much they eat, how many of them you have, and how much pasture you have. And in that pasture, how much dry matter is available to eat. And when I say dry matter, that's the mass of the plant with the water taken out. So we can input values that we know into these equations to come up with stocking density recommendations. Again, I'm going to skip through here quickly because this math can be edited for anyone in your specific situation, and I'm getting close to running out of time. So as we get closer to the end here, we have a few more things I want to elaborate on, some of which are for first-time pasture managers that may be starting from scratch. So as we get there, we can see that we can calculate this equation based on many things. We can do it based on how many animals we have and how much space we need. Or we can do it backwards with how much space you have, how many animals can you get. It's all estimation. But to summarize here, to be a good pasture manager, you don't want to overgraze those pastures. We want to prevent animals from going back and grazing right where they were before. It's not good for plant health. It's not good for animal health. We want to keep them moving forward. We want to allow our most sensitive animals to have the first chance to graze so they have less exposure to things that may be harmful to them. And when we consider our multi-species grazing, we want to do so in a smart fashion so that we can allow access to the plants that are most desirable for that species without having another animal consume them first. There's lots of alternative forages we can consider adding into our system. This can help provide more to eat in times when there traditionally might not be as much, and also provide the variety we may need to fit all of our species needs. Whenever it seems needed, adding supplemental feed is not a sin. Not feeding our animals adequately is a bigger problem. So part of being a good pasture manager is recognizing when feed is limited and we need to supplement. Then also monitoring both our animals and our plants as they grow to make sure that they remain successful. And then culling animals and or forages, getting rid of the ones that don't fit our management style. We want the system to work for us, not us to work for it. And we want to choose animals that also work for us and work in the system. So if an animal is just not working and you don't have another way that you can change this system to make it work, cut ties with that animal, move on, find something that does work and is worth your time, worth your investment. So here's some information on that starting from scratch. What do I choose? What do I plant? How do I rehab these pastures that I bought at an auction or inherited from someone that have been neglected? Lots of forage planting advice out there available for you. You can scan this QR code and it will take you to some forage planting advice. As I alluded to, we're going to go fast here through the end because I'm getting to the end of my time. Before you plant anything, I would suggest you do a soil test. Doing a soil test is going to give you an indication of what can grow successfully in your area, as well as the history of fertilizer application in the zones, and also give you an idea of where you should focus manure deposition on. There's lots of different methods for soil sampling. Depending on your situation, you can pick a method that's best for you, and you can easily connect with someone in your local area to get a soil test done. You can do that by connecting with your local extension office or your soil and water conservation district as well. There's lots of different methods for planting. Seed, conventional tillage is an option. A lot of people prefer to do conventional tillage, providing a smooth, firm, weed-free seed bed. It's excellent, works for many species. But in a lot of cases, we're going to want to pursue a no-till or minimal-till seeding, whether that's because of topography and erosion concerns, whether it's about water quality concerns. And my biggest concern is weed pressure. I tend to find in the situations I work with that when we till that seed bed, we stir up all kinds of weeds that we never seem to have before, and then we have a weed problem to deal with. The no-till or minimal till seeding situation I think we tend to have better weed control. So in most cases, I will suggest people go towards these no-till or minimal till seeding recommendations. Here are some legumes that are commonly used in the state of Ohio with their seeding rates, planting dates, and planting depths. And you can get this information from the Ohio Agronomy Guide if you're not able to copy it down fast enough in the session. We also have the same information for common perennial grass plants as well. We'll talk a little bit here about management in the first year. It essentially comes down to we want to allow enough time for these plants to fully establish before we begin harvesting them. They need to have good root growth before we go in and defoliate. So typically, we're going to wait about 60 to 90 days before we do any type of defoliation. And the first one may be beneficial to do mechanically. That way that we get an even stand removal, and we also prevent that selective grazing activity of the animals, and we can get good thick regrowth back. Here is some seeding recommendations for those annual plants that I talked about before, even including suggestions for fertilizer application. Again, like I mentioned, these can provide a great deal of flexibility in grazing systems, especially those that may be beginning fresh. We're going to skip through some of this management on annuals so that we can get to our helpful videos. We have all kinds of videos available from Extension that you can consult on specific topics. If you're interested in our full collection of forage focus videos, which is a show we tend to do once a month on forages, you can find all kinds of things at this QR code. Fall seeding advice, which is one of the best times, in my opinion, to seed, less weed pressure in fall. You can find information there at that QR code. And frost seeding. Before we know it, it's going to be time to frost seed. Frost seeding is a method you can easily use to add more legumes into your pastures, increase diversity, increase the amount of minerals and also protein available in your pasture. Add that diversity for the complex mixture of your multi-species grazing operation without too much effort. So check that one out as well. And we also have printable charts of all of those seeding rates that I had showed earlier, if you're interested. For additional questions, comments, or concerns, you're welcome to reach out to me. I wish I could have been there with you today, but I'm sorry that I missed you. Hopefully we'll meet again at another event, but you can always contact me by phone or email. I do my best to reply to people promptly, and I would be happy to talk more with you about your individual situation or to link you with more local advice than I can provide, depending on where you are. So I hope that this session has been somewhat helpful, maybe giving you some ideas of where you can go from here. If you would like to explore more information from The Ohio State University, I suggest you visit and follow these pages. We have a Forages team website, forages.osu.edu. We have a beef team website. Garth Ruff was there earlier presenting. That website is beef.osu.edu. Garth is our forage or our beef extension field specialist. And we also have our sheep team webpage. Brady, our a small ruminant specialist, is going to be there after me today, and our website there is sheep.osu.edu. So in the case that you aren't ready to reach out to someone in person or you're just looking for supplemental information, go visit these web pages, star them, bookmark them as your favorites, subscribe to get the regular posting notifications in your email box. You won't be disappointed. With that, I'll close and I will say have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the expo, and please reach out if there's anything that we can do to be of service to you. Bye.